Hello there. Welcome to Newsnight. I am Ladi Akiridoluale. It's our pleasure to have you join us. Today on the program, we are focused on Nigeria's economy and the issues generated by it, especially in the era of COVID-19. What are the implications of Nigeria's poverty, unemployment, inflation, and exchange rates, amongst others, on its development planning and aspirations? More importantly, what's to be done to make improvements in this regard, and is government on the right tracks? Newsnight talks to global economist and member of the Presidential Economic Advisory Council, Dr. Iyabo Masha. Dr. Masha, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Let me get your general sense of where we are as a country at the moment, talking with specific reference to our economy. Do you think we have fared better, for example, than others in the aftermath of COVID-19?
Very interesting question. Yes, indeed. The latest report that came out, of course, we have to talk in terms of the performance of the economy. And what we're looking at for 2020 is a contraction of less than 2%. Now, compared to other African countries, that is impressive. First, because we had not just the COVID-19 shock, we also had the oil price shock. So to be able to come up with a contraction of around 2% when other countries are having 8%, 7%, and the likes of that, then I think that is good, especially within Africa. And when you look at some of the performance in Asia, in Europe, though they're not strictly comparable, then you can say that we did come out of the recession also earlier. Some countries are still in recession as we speak. Is the economy very strong? No, it's still a weak economy, but at least the period of negative growth is over for now.
All right, Doc. The last point you made, talking about that the growth coming out of recession was quite weak. A number of people already pointed at that and said that, therefore, we shouldn't celebrate because even if we're out of recession, there's still quite a bit we need to do if we're to get the economy on a sustainable growth pattern. In that regard, would you, for example, say that where we are now, given what you said about the oil price shock and then the COVID-19 shock, where we are now going forward, can you see signs that we're already now on that path to sustainable growth?
I will say there are signals to that effect. What you have to understand is that, like individuals and their response to COVID infection, the Nigerian economy also had pre-existing conditions. Pre-existing conditions meaning that the economy was fragile, has been for several years. The structure of the economy is such that there was quite a strong limit to non-oil growth. And that's because some of the structural transformation that ought to have happened over the decades didn't happen. So those are pre-existing conditions. The infrastructure gap, for example, even gender gap, high levels of poverty, all those things will reduce the speed at which an economy can really grow. So we're growing, and there are signs of some of the investments being undertaken, 25,000 megawatts of energy planned over the next 2 to 3 years. Some of those investments to bridge the infrastructure gap, especially on railroads, on highways, all of those things show that we're on a path. Where that path leads us to, we wouldn't really know until another 2 years or so. But that's usually the path towards growth and recovery.
There's been GDP growth recently.
Yes.
To what would you specifically assign that to? What do you think is responsible for that? And what do we need to do to make that more sustainable?
Yes, so if you look at the pre-COVID economy, so COVID year 2020 is an outlier, so it's not really the kind of year that you want to use for comparative purpose. But if you look at the pre-COVID economy, we had substantial growth in fintech and financial services with a lot of interest from the outside world on the mobile money payments and lots of investments in technology. In fact, the whole technology apparatus, I think it's an area that has a lot of upside and that already showed signs as where the growth of the economy could increase on. Then if you look at the primary sector too, new mines in new areas like gold, for example. Of course, there may or may not have been gold smuggling in the past, but we do know that this year will be the first year that gold will be officially exported and will reflect in our balance of payments as an export. So that's also something that is already the non-oil mineral sector. There's a lot of investments going on, but also a lot of interest also from the outside world. And then when you look at the industrial sector, a few industries are growing, I will say, but there's still scope for industrial deepening because what we have essentially are sectors that are, dependent on very primary kind of production. So we're not yet there on the industrial area, but it's an area that has a lot of upsides going forward.
Now, I'm happy you mentioned that because it brings me to the issue of manufacturing. That's an area where we could witness a lot of growth because Nigeria has a very big market on its own. This is happening at the same time as the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is coming up. And the rest of West Africa, for example, could also serve as a market for some of our companies here. But this, all the while, whenever we talk to some of these industry players, they talk about macroeconomic indices not being completely favorable to them and the fact that there's uncertainty. Is that uncertainty, for example, limited just to us, or is it a global uncertainty that preceded COVID-19, in your view?
It's probably a combination of both. I will say that the major problem is that over the years, the industrial policy and the structure of incentives was not aligned to the needs of the economy. It was more aligned towards the very basic production. I do agree that macroeconomic indices are important and they determine, the decision to invest by investors. And that has been a kind of constraining factor in the country, especially when you look at interest rate and exchange rate. Those two, absolutely important. But even within that constraint, the major challenge I see is that over the years, our policies were not focused on in the kind of industrial sector that would be very complex and that will produce complex goods that are tailored for the export market. Now, there's a shift in industrial policy thinking, and the government is now pushing out the kind of policies that will focus in that area. Obviously, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, the ECOWAS region, and all of those, they're very big markets. But the markets exist, but we need to do certain things internally to be able to take advantage of the market. The tariff, you can reduce tariff to zero, and yet it will not support trade because of non-tariff barriers. So non-tariff barriers like our ports, the whole port apparatus was built for an economy that was only 40% of the current size of Nigeria's economy. So, and it was built in the thinking that this is an importing economy. Now, that has to re-engineered to make it more trade oriented, more export oriented. And then all of these things, then the industries can really take advantage because they can lower their costs and they can then be competitive outside Nigeria.
You mentioned rates, so let me delve into the issue of rates. Let's start with the one that, I'm not an economist, you are, but the one that seems to have the most wide-ranging effect, generally speaking, which would probably be the rate of inflation, because that's the one that affects prices, if I'm correct.
Yes.
Are we getting it there? Are you worried, for example, about where our rate of inflation is at the moment? It's a bit high, going by what I've heard from some of your colleagues. Is this something to worry about, or is it part of the adjustment that we need to do in order to get ourselves back on track?
Well, inflation is never a good thing. So I would say that, yes, it's something to worry about. But there are some issues that are driving the inflation, and so addressing those issues would probably...
Could you give us an idea of some of those issues?
So, for example, we do know that the northern region is the food basket of the country, but with the security challenges and disruption of movement of goods between the north and the south, that's one of the reasons why there's this push on prices. The other reason is also the limited incentives for agricultural production. So 40% of the goods produced in the farms do not get to the markets. They are basically thrown away. And why? Because there are no extension services, no cold storage, transportation, and all of that. So those are what we call the more of the supply side push on inflation. And as the harvesting season comes up, rainy season and all of that, we would most likely see a decline in prices.
That will bring
in food prices.
Okay.
But then there's still the non-food part of inflation. I think overall, monetary policy would help to have a more stable price level, since that is one of the most important indicators of the health of an economy.
Interest rates. One of the things that someone in my position gets to hear a lot is that many of those who want to produce and who want to access capital for the purposes of participating in the production process say that the rates at which banks give out funds for business product is way too high for them to be able to repay in a sustainable manner. That's on one hand. Those who have resources and want to invest, who want to save in the banking system, talk about the savings rate being too low because they are competing with government for the same funds. In that regard, what do you make of it?
For the interest rate, ultimately it has to reflect the costs of financial services from the perspective of the bank. So if banks believe that there's a high cost on maybe things like generators, or the staff cost is high, or the high cost of infrastructure in the country, then it reflects in their own cost, which the interest rate is an element of their cost. Now, how has it worked out in other countries? Financial services in Nigeria is more expensive than in most African countries. I have to accept that. But with more competition with these mobile money operators, the POS operators, and all of these people coming into the financial services space, we could gradually see a decline in interest rate as the cost of services provided to the and also as an element of the cost of producers. In terms of whether or not it's too low, the savings rate is low.
Right.
Well, what I will advise such people to do is to look for alternative investment. Maybe they should start a factory which will bring
higher rate of return.
a higher rate of return, and not just park money in the bank, you know. So that's one way to address that issue.
Foreign exchange. This is another area where people say that Nigeria may be doing a bit of a flip if it is to succeed. But that it needs to be a fine balance, because you have incentives for export, but you also have the need to pay off debts. And these are all affected by whatever your exchange rate is at any point in time. There are those who talk about the forces of demand and supply. A lot of people want foreign exchange for all kinds of purposes. So where are we with regards to this foreign exchange rate? In your view, I mean, you've had experience in this regard outside of Nigeria. Are we getting it right? Is there something that we need to do differently? Because the arguments have continued over what it is that we are doing and how we should go about it.
I believe, based on what I've read and the different groups I've talked to, that there's a desire to have access to foreign exchange, especially from the manufacturers and importers. So they are more open to having it so that they can at least keep their business going. And then whatever cost that comes with is something that they could pass on to consumers. That's the sense I get. But we have to realize that in the short term, we would be constrained in how much foreign exchange we will have available to power the economy. And that is because we have basically one major source of foreign exchange, which is crude oil sales. The rest, all the other exports, especially the non-oil exports, agri exports, I don't think they're up to $1 billion of exports in a year. So that means that over time, as the transformation of the economy towards a more trade-oriented economy takes place, then that constraint on foreign exchange will be relaxed. It's not going to be relaxed today or tomorrow, but it's something that will take place as the economy transforms.
Doc, the recent employment rate statistics or unemployment rate statistics released by the NBS, that's the National Bureau of Statistics, gave cause for worry because it's reached the highest level in recent years. Some would say we shouldn't really be surprised at that because of what happened in 2020 and the aftermath of that, not just in Nigeria. But there are those who talk about comorbidities, the things that had been there before COVID came and exposed everything. Now, already there is the unemployment rate, there is the underemployment rate as well. Those who are in some form of employment, but they're not fully employed. If you add that to the unemployment rate, it's quite high. What should we do?
What should we do? Well, first of all, let me just acknowledge that, yes, the economy has not been producing enough jobs for the new people entering the labor market. So if you look at the same unemployment statistics published by the NBS, I think it shows that around 3% growth every year of new labor force. These are the people
coming in
that are ready to work over the age of I think it's 18 years and 18 and 64 years.
Right.
So yes, there's a large group of people coming into the labor market, but the issue is that the structure of the economy, an economy that has about 3% coming into the labor market will need to grow at around 5-6% in order to be able to absorb most of these new entrants. Now, we haven't seen that kind of growth in a very long time. I think in the early 2000s was when we had those kind of growth. So companies can only demand for more labor when they are, growing and they're expanding output. So I think that what we can do about it, some of these issues will tie into what I said about the structural transformation of the economy. The shift now is towards policies that are more effective in labor-intensive sectors, so that it's not just creating, incentivizing sectors at a general level, but looking at the capability of a sector to produce more jobs, a more labor-intensive, in more labor-intensive sectors. So those kind of policies would create the room for a higher level of employment over time. And of course, as investments in infrastructure, in education, in all of these increases, then even the existing companies would be able to produce more, would operate at higher capacity levels than they are operating now. So again, this is not there is no shotgun approach, but in terms of policies in place to enable structural transformation, I think these are some of the things that could become apparent over the next 2 to 3 years.
There is a question as well of whether Nigeria has a revenue problem or it has a debt problem. Some people will say it's both. Some will say it's one or the other. Because we need to finance quite a lot of things. I mean, if we take the infrastructure that we talked about earlier, that is money. Depending on who you ask, some people say you need $1 trillion over the next 10 years and so on. These are huge sums, and it's not exactly as if we are producing at the level at which we can access this kind of sums. First of all, how do you think we can grow our revenue to match some of these our aspirations in the short and possibly medium term? How do we grow our revenue profile in such a way that maybe we wouldn't need to be emphasizing so much about our debt?
Okay. The issue about revenue is that first we have to recognize the challenges and know that we're operating at a very small space. We have 40% of the population living in poverty. So that means you already have 40% that do not have the capacity to pay tax. Then out of the remaining ones that are, you have 50% of the GDP in the informal sector. Again, the informal sector is very difficult to tax, high rates of tax avoidance and tax evasion. So you are pretty much left with the formal sector, which is easier to tax, and they are easier to go after, maybe the banks, the telecoms, and all of that. But when you look at the revenue performance last year, it's quite impressive. 5.3 trillion, the highest ever for FIRS, and not only that, happening in a period of economic downturn.
That's right.
So that speaks to some of the improvements in tax administration that is going on. But what I would caution against is maybe putting too much pressure on the formal sector, because that's the goose that lays the golden egg. So there's still some areas where revenue can grow. A report came out of the National Assembly this past week that the state-owned enterprises are hiding close to $10 billion. So that's an area that, policies could go after. I've even seen some estimates of up to $20 billion.
Yes, that are being hidden, yes.
That are being hidden, that's one. And then the whole apparatus of the incentives, the waivers, concessions,
duties, and so on.
And all of those ones, those are the key areas where I think the upside is for taxation. In the region, our tax is already one of the highest, for at least the corporate income tax. Ghana's tax is 25% corporate income tax, and for us it's 30%. So other countries, Mauritius, 15%, and much smaller percentages. So I think we should leave the corporate income tax as it is and then go after these other areas.
Are you worried about our debt profile? Is it something, or maybe let me rephrase, is it something we should worry about? Given the size of our economy, given what we've taken the loans for, and possibly our ability to repay if those things that the investments went into pan out the way we expected.
Yeah, and I think that is the real important issue, that inevitably, if an economy is growing, that economy is going to be borrowing more, because a growing economy will need to finance investment, will need to do more infrastructure projects so that the private sector can just come in and kickstart the economy. In terms of what has been going on, the projects, I see that there are lots of investments in roads and railways and rural infrastructure. Then the energy deficit that,
Yes.
that we talked about, 25,000 megawatts from 3,000 in 3 years. So these are all very, very good projects that would allow the economy, once they're up and running, to grow at a much faster rate. And not only that, they're projects that could pay for themselves depending on how the underlying debt is structured. I think what should be our concern is ability to service the debt, which goes back to what we're talking about, revenue. That's
Right.
one. And number two is the terms of the loans, that the terms of the loans are favorable and allows us to have breathing space. And if you look at the composition of the loan, for example, I think a third of the foreign loan is owed to the International Development Association, World Bank.
Right.
And those loans are very, very concessionally. They carry almost 0% interest. So those kind of favorable terms are very, very essential for making loans work in general in many countries. And of course, last but not the least, is value for money. So we're structuring the loans, and whatever is being undertaken is something that is of value, and that we have really driven the hardest bargain and are getting them at the right price.
I want to drill down a little bit on the issue of how those two shocks that we underwent last year really tended to derail us significantly. The oil price shock, which came after the COVID shock, which more or less shut down the Nigerian economy for most of 2020. Now, it does appear as if COVID is going to be around for some time, contrary to the expectation that maybe we were getting over it. As we speak now, some places in Europe are going into a third wave of infections, one or two countries in Africa as well, that may presage some form of lockdown or the other, which would affect our trading abilities with them.
Yes.
Here, mercifully, and contrary to all predictions, we didn't have the kind of impact or the kind of fatalities that were widely expected from COVID. But then the major source of our income that you mentioned earlier was very badly affected. So as we are now, it does appear as if we're walking a very tight rope. How do we make that rope less tight, if I may use that phrase, in the sense that a lot of these decisions are dependent on things that we don't have control over,
Yes.
that are happening elsewhere. So even if Nigerians are not dying of COVID-19, if others in other places are, then our ability to sell them things or to get things from them will be affected.
Yes.
So in that kind of, in that sense, what do we need to do locally where we have more control in order to make our own system more sustainable so that we are less reliant on what is going on outside?
Okay, I think the first thing is to recognize the global trends that will shape the post-COVID world. Recognition of those trends will then inform the kind of policy options that we will take. So, for example, because of COVID-19, yes, many countries are now rethinking this whole idea of offshoring. They are bringing back production to the countries. They are closing down the supply chains that are outside in other parts of the world. That's one. Number two, countries are also trying to make progress on transitioning out of fossil fuel and moving towards renewables. Again, that's something that will impact us considerably. So, and I think the third issue is countries are now even more focused on the issues of inequality, digital inequality, income inequality, gender inequality. So with those, how do we redesign, reimagine development in Nigeria in such a way that we are not left surprised and we're able to take advantage of these opportunities? From what I have seen, I think it's a very resilient economy. The Nigerian economy is a very resilient economy, and people are quite ready to take advantage of emerging opportunities as they emerge. But still, the policy direction has to be ready to give the incentives to succeed in some of these areas. I think the most important one for us is the realization that the oil economy as we know it is not going to be around for much longer, and then planning for a post-oil economy from the point of view of diversification and increasing the complexity of our economy. So that is one way for Nigeria to plan for it. And of course, the other way is to actually get the whole idea, the whole planning apparatus, the medium-term plans to reflect some of these policy choices that we need to make going forward.
The Economic Growth and Recovery Plan, the EGRP, addresses some of these things that you've talked about. Yes. How have you seen that unfold, watching it?
Well, I think the ERGP is now being succeeded by a new plan. I think it's a 2021-2025
plan. Indeed.
Yes, and then there's also a longer-term perspective plan, which is up to 2050. So first of all, it's a very comprehensive plan, and it addresses all these developmental challenges. The kind of issues that it's not like COVID where you are just reacting.
Right.
We are talking of issues that a country is responding to what its own vision is, and also what the changes in the external environment imposes on the country. So a lot of the issues on transitioning towards taking advantage of opportunities in ECOWAS, in the Africa Free Trade Area, and developing the non-oil sector, investments in agriculture, investments in human capital, education, all of those are very well addressed there. And I think also the issue of climate change. Climate change, of course, is one of the most important development challenges of the world today. And we have not put much emphasis on it in the past, but I think it's now coming up into the top of the policy agenda. So all of these issues are addressed in the plan, which is under construction. But of course, the important thing is to, in the implementation stage, to walk the talk, and also to make it something that guides day-to-day policies, so that it's not just another strategy or paper somewhere.
That gets dropped.
Yeah, yeah.
You, and correct me if I'm wrong, about 3 times already within this interview, you've talked about the gender gap, gender inequality, and women. That gives me the impression that you're very passionate about this.
I wouldn't say so, but
Oh,
I'm a woman.
and you think that this is probably the way to go. Now, for Nigeria as a country, for example, we do not make provision for women to, for example, find it easy to do the work-life balance. More often than not, women tend to drop out of the workforce here because once they go, get married, and start to have children. And therefore, that's education investment lost once that process takes place. And then there's the issue of empowering them. And not talking here now about victims. We're talking about people who have ideas.
Yes.
I know we're not doing enough, so I don't need to ask you if we are. But what should we be doing, and how should we be going about this?
On this area, there's so many best practices. On education, our enrollment rate for women, I think, is about 50% or so compared to men. I think male enrollment in basic primary and tertiary education is about 70-something%. So those are the key areas, because first of all, to be able to be empowered and to be able to participate in the labor market, you need education. So education policy is one, getting more women into schools, even if necessary, incentivizing parents to bring their female children to school. And that would help in developing the skills that they need to be more productive members of society. The other issue is relating to the job market. As you rightly pointed out, it's difficult for most women at that level to remain in the labor market because of the demands of child care and taking care of their family. And this is where those kind of activities can be subsidized by the government, which is what is done all over the world to make the access, to make it less expensive, make it less of a penalty for a woman to be devoting time to taking care of the children. Then the issue of empowerment, what we have seen is that countries like Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Rwanda, they were able to achieve very rapid progress by setting aside percentage of the power, of seats, say in parliament for women. It's just like one term only, and it's to build their political skills. And that helps a lot because women bring a very unique perspective to the table. They look at issues that have more profound impact on society. So if you have a National Assembly or a State Assembly that has a large composition of women, you would actually see that in the quality of the bills that are being discussed and the kind of focus that those people will have on the issues. So I think it's something that should be part and parcel of our development paradigm. And that's not because I'm a woman.
Well, actually, I was waiting for you to land so that I could say that I remember hearing the Rwandan president, Paul Kagame, say that most, if not all, the success that Rwanda has achieved in the last 2 decades or more has been because if you take a look at the country's governance structure, the parliament has a majority of women, his cabinet is composed majority women, and so on, that often what you said about the kind of issues that get discussed and the perspectives that women bring to those discussions tend to enlarge the vision of what it is that is being discussed or what it is that is being debated. I want you to talk about, being someone who has quite a bit of experience internationally, I want you to talk a little bit about the income gap that exists between what women and men get for services or for work. Many would argue that in Nigeria it isn't there because, especially in the formal sector, both government and the organized private sector, there isn't really this discrepancy of the gap between what women and men get for the same job. Perhaps in the informal economy. Yes. You mentioned the issue of best practices earlier on. and how those countries, how those economies got women up the scale.
Yes.
How can we replicate that here?
Those kind of initiatives have to be legislated. It's really difficult to expect that human beings will do certain things out of the goodness of their heart. It has to be legislated, and there has to be penalties for non-performance. So something like wage discrimination is a major offense in many advanced countries. It's difficult to prove because because they will tell you why the wage is different. But, at least it's there as a signal that society will not tolerate this. And when employers know that society will not tolerate it, then they are more careful how they discriminate. And that applies not only to gender, but also to race. It's all about the signaling that society brings out. Now, in Nigeria, as you rightly pointed out, there really isn't much information about the gender disparity in the formal sector. There's still a wide disparity. And that disparity is not necessarily in the sense that people are paid differently. It's in career progression. So if somebody hits the glass ceiling, by the time they get to step 5 on the ladder, and some people are still climbing to step 10 on the ladder, then effectively their income is going to be lower. And that's a disparity in income. But the informal sector, some of the reports and some of the research that has been undertaken shows that the per capita income of the female in the informal sector is about 70% of the male in Nigeria. But what I find most interesting is that with lower opportunities and with also lower income per capita, the female poverty rate is lower than the male poverty rate. And that tells you what can be achieved when you empower women, because they are much more good and much more perceptive when it comes to addressing societal ills.
I hate to go back to this, but I have to, for the simple reason that it appears as if we don't seem to have understood really how much of an impact this is going to have. And again, I'm going to ask you to speak to this from the international perspective, and which is the way that COVID-19 has altered everything we know about economic policy, about trade issues, about how the world is organized.
Yes.
It does appear as if, at a particular level, countries like Nigeria are still dealing with the basics, whereas those a notch higher than us have moved into what now needs to be done to cope with the new system. You already alluded to one or two of it when you talked about the education, the change in the education system. We are lagging behind in that. But primarily economically now, we're going to fall further behind, even though before COVID, we were already far behind. As a percentage of what of world trade, Nigeria and Africa was behind, even before COVID came. So now we're even going to be further behind. How do we try not to be so far behind?
The response, the policy response, is what determines whether we will fall further behind or we will even be ahead of the pack. So trade policies, policies relating to education, yes, countries are reimagining development. That's the new concept we're dealing with now in development economics. They're looking at even how to provide education differently, health differently, even how cities are transformed. Now, countries are talking of people working more from home. Do we need as many buildings? How do you cope with urban and regional planning in that context? A lot of these issues are already on the agenda in the medium-term plan. So the important thing will be how does it move from ideas to actual concrete implementation? But the other issue relates to the state and local government, the subnational governments, because whilst a lot of the policies on economy, security, they're driven by federal, functionally, most of them are federal functions.
Right.
But a lot of the issues that impact on how you and I live, what the quality of our life is on a day-to-day basis, are the responsibilities of the subnational governments.
In this case, for us, the state
and local government. So do I spend 4 hours in the traffic, or do I spend 1 hour? What kind of public transportation is available? What are the health facilities available in my areas? So all those issues means that even the state governments are now going to start working on how to be much more effective, how governance can be much more effective at the state level. So when we have that meeting point of both the federal and the state and local governments working hand in hand, creating a much more livable environment for us, then we will be in a position to come ahead of the pack in terms of response for COVID-19 impacts.
You work very well, and you're very familiar with the work of the international development bodies. In some countries, we call them international development partners, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. Depending on who you ask, to some people, they are villains. To other people, they are saviors. They come in and assist. In the aftermath of COVID-19, virtually every country benefited from some kind of development assistance to cope with the ravages of COVID-19. But beyond that now, what do you think their roles are? What are the roles they are playing now to move countries to reimagine their growth and development aspirations, one? And then in our own case in Nigeria, where do you think the gaps are that if they were looking, they could point to assist us move faster?
Okay, in terms of what the the multilateral organizations are doing, you are very correct. At least last year, they assisted a lot of countries, and Nigeria, 3.5 billion from IMF, I think, and then World Bank and the Africa Development Bank also put some money on the table. And that contributed to the speedy revival and recovery of the economy. Going forward, the countries, the multilateral organizations are now advocating for debt, some kind of debt relief or debt. It's not going to be debt forgiveness, but there will be, they are pushing the advanced economies to consider reducing one way or the other the debt payments of the poorer economies.
Dr. Masha, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure having you with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
That's today's episode of Newsnight. Thanks for watching. We would like to know what you think of the issues raised during this conversation. Our social media handles are right there on your screen. You can also listen to this and previous episodes of the program via our podcast. Visit our website, channelstv.com/podcast. I'm Ladi Akeredoluale.